Everything looked the way Elena had always dreamed it would look. Noah and Jiho in the garden, two boys who had found each other through the wreckage of adult mistakes, chasing each other around the yard with the unbothered joy of children who have no idea how complicated the world is, and no reason yet to find out. Kenji's voice drifting from inside the house, low, warm, the voice of a man at peace with where he had landed. Elena sat on the garden steps with both hands on her bump and watched it all and let herself feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Safe. The baby was coming in 6 weeks. The house was full in the way she had always wanted a house to be full, not just with things, not just with money and marble and the trappings of an empire, but with noise and life and the specific warmth of people who belonged to each other. She had fought for this. Every inch of it. And today, just today, she was letting herself simply sit in it. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. A number she hadn't seen in years. A number she had never deleted because some numbers you keep the way you keep old scars. Not because you want to, but because removing them feels like pretending something didn't happen. She stood up slowly, walked away from the boys, away from Kenji's voice inside the house, away from the warmth of everything she had built. She pressed the phone to her ear. Grace? Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Elena. The voice on the other end was older now, trembling at the edges. Baby, they found the file. They found everything. The garden sounds continued behind her, the boys laughing, the evening birds, the ordinary music of a life she had refused to let anyone take from her. Elena closed her eyes. How long do I have? She asked. Grace's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Marcus already has a copy. He sent it to 3 people this morning. Elena opened her eyes, looked out at the garden, at Noah throwing his head back laughing at something Jiho did, at Jiho's face, Kenji's eyes, her boys, her family, her everything. Her jaw set, her shoulders dropped back, and the woman who had been resting, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe, put herself away, and the queen came back. All right, she said quietly, then we move tonight. Before we go any further, I have to be honest with you. Building this channel has been one of the hardest and most rewarding things I have ever done. My husband has been my rock through every single step of this journey, and he made me a promise. When this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, he will fulfill a wish I have carried in my heart for a very long time. I need your help to get there. If this story has ever moved you, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment. Share this video. Every single action you take helps this channel grow and brings me one step closer to that promise being kept. We are so close. Let's get there together. And tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single comment and I want to see every country represented. Also, if you are just finding Elena's story for the first time, parts 1 and 2 are in the comment section and the description below. Start there. You will not regret it. Now let's get back to Elena, because this final chapter is about to show you what a queen is truly made of. Marcus did not find the file. That was the first thing Elena needed to understand. Marcus was many things: arrogant, wounded, relentless in the specific, exhausting way of men who cannot accept that they lost. But he was not sophisticated enough to find something that had been buried this carefully for this long. Someone found it for him. His name was Richard Hale. Elena had heard the name in fragments over the years. The shadow behind the Hale Empire. The man Marcus had spent his entire life trying to impress and never quite managed to. Old money, old connections. The kind of power that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Richard had watched his son get publicly dismantled by a woman Marcus had dismissed as inconsequential and said nothing publicly. Not a statement, not a denial, nothing. But privately, quietly, patiently, with the particular cold discipline of a man who had built an empire by never moving until he was certain of the outcome, Richard had been building something. He was not motivated by Marcus's wounded pride. He was motivated by something colder and more dangerous than pride. Legacy. Noah Hale Kim. A boy carrying Hale blood who would never carry the Hale name. A boy whose very existence, healthy, educated, powerful, growing up inside the Kim syndicate's protection, represented everything Richard had spent his life building, being inherited by someone else's dynasty. That he could not accept. So he went looking, hired the right people, asked the right questions in the right places, and eventually, buried under 15 years of careful living and deliberate distance, he found the file. He didn't tell Marcus what it was immediately. He made sure it was airtight first, made sure it could be used, made sure that when it landed, it would land with enough force to unravel not just Elena's reputation, but the legal foundation of everything built in Noah's name. Then he handed it to his son like a weapon and watched Marcus's eyes light up for the first time in months. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study and made one carefully placed call. "I have a name for you," he said to the federal investigator on the other end. His voice was smooth, unhurried. The voice of a man who had made calls like this his entire life and knew exactly how they worked. Elena Kim, formerly Elena James. A pause. "I think you will find her history very interesting." He hung up, poured himself a drink, and waited. Because men like Richard Hale had learned a long time ago that the most powerful move you can make is the one you make before the other person knows the game has started. Elena went to her study alone. She closed the door behind her, locked it, something she almost never did in this house, in this life she had built, where locked doors felt like an old language she had been trying to forget. She went to the bottom drawer of her desk, moved the files stacked on top, reached to the very back, and pulled out something that had lived there for 4 years, since the day she and Kenji moved into this house, and she transferred it from the last hiding place to this one. A plain envelope, cream-colored once, now aged to the particular yellow of things that have been handled too many times by hands that couldn't quite bring themselves to throw them away. She sat down, held it for a moment without opening it. Then she opened it. The documents inside were exactly as she remembered, crisp when they were given to her, now soft at the folds. A placement agency letterhead, her name typed cleanly on 3 separate forms. Employee of record, processing clerk. Dates spanning 3 months of her 19th year. She looked at her name on those forms and felt what she always felt when she looked at them. Not shame, exactly. Something older and more complicated than shame. The particular weight of being 19 and desperate and trusting the wrong person and not understanding until it was almost too late what that trust had made her part of. She had been in the city for 4 months when the woman approached her. Professional, well-dressed, the kind of person who looked like safety when you had nothing. The job was simple, a placement agency, children being relocated to families abroad, good families, she was told. Children who needed homes. Elena would process the paperwork, verify documents, file applications, coordinate transfers. She believed it for 3 months. Then one evening she was working late and she saw something in a file she wasn't supposed to see. A name that appeared twice, once as a receiving family, once on a separate list she had never been shown before. She pulled that list, read it again, and understood. She didn't go home that night. She went directly to the police, sat in a cold interview room for 6 hours and gave them every name, every address, every document she had ever touched. Her hands didn't stop shaking the entire time. Her testimony was the cornerstone that brought the network down, but her name was still in those files. As an employee, as someone who processed those documents for 3 months before she understood what they really were. And that, just that, stripped of context, stripped of the testimony that followed, stripped of the children who went home because of what she did, was all Richard Hale needed. Elena set the documents down on her desk, and the tears came. Not one, not the single controlled tear she had allowed herself in the back of a car after a meeting with Soyun. All of them. 15 years of carrying this in absolute silence, through Marcus, through the pregnancy, through building herself from nothing into something, through Kenji, through the Empire, through 3 parts of fighting and winning and refusing to fall. All of it arriving at once in a wave she had no strength left to hold back. She put her face in her hands, and she let herself fall apart. Completely. For exactly 5 minutes, because she had earned those 5 minutes. And when they were over, she was going to wipe her face, sit straight, and fight. She looked at the clock on her desk, watched the second hand move, gave herself every second of those 5 minutes. Then she took one breath, wiped her face with both hands, sat straight, and picked up her phone. Grace answered on the second ring. "Tell me everything," Elena said. Grace told her. The federal investigator Richard had contacted, a man named Doyle who had spent 3 years building a supplementary case file on the dismantled network, looking for loose ends that hadn't been properly closed. Richard had given him Elena's name as exactly that, a loose end. The journalist, a woman at a mid-level publication with enough credibility to do damage and enough ambition to not ask too many questions about where a story came from. The St. Jude's board member, a man named Hartley, who had never fully accepted Elena's presence in the school's power structure and would need very little convincing to call an emergency meeting. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Grace, did he find the testimony file?" A pause. The sound of Grace moving in her house somewhere. "I've been through everything I can access. There's no indication he knows it exists." Elena nodded slowly. "Where is it?" "With me," Grace said, "where it has always been." "I need it," Elena said. "Tonight." "I know," Grace said. "I already have it ready." Elena stood up from her desk, straightened her robe, looked at the worn envelope on her desk, at her 19-year-old name typed on those forms, and made a decision that had been waiting 15 years to be made. No more hiding it. No more carrying it alone in locked drawers and careful silences. The thing you are most afraid of being known loses its power the moment you choose to say it yourself. She walked to her study door, put her hand on the handle, and stopped. Because on the other side of that door was Kenji, her husband, the most dangerous and most gentle man she had ever known. The man who had chosen her completely and repeatedly and had never once been given the full truth of what she had come from and what she had survived. She had protected him from this for years, told herself it was because it didn't matter anymore, told herself the past was the past and this was now, and there was no reason to put something this heavy into the foundation of what they were building. But the real reason, the one she had never quite let herself look at directly, was simpler and more frightening than any of that. She was afraid of his eyes changing. She took one breath, made her decision, and opened the door. Kenji was standing right there, like he had been waiting for exactly as long as it took her to be ready. His face told her everything. He knew something was wrong, he didn't know what, and he was not going anywhere until she told him. "Elena," he said quietly, "talk to me." She looked at her husband, at this man who had stood beside her through everything, and she said the words she should have said years ago. "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." She walked past him to the living room, sat down, waited for him to sit across from her, and then she began at the beginning, the real beginning. 19 years old, a city that didn't know her name, a woman who looked like safety, and 3 months that changed the entire shape of her life. She told him all of it, every word, from the beginning to the end, and every detail in between that she had spent 15 years carefully not saying out loud to anyone who mattered. The placement agency, the paperwork, the 3 months of not knowing, the night she found the list, the police station, the 6 hours in the interview room with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the testimony that brought the network down, the new name, the new city, the new life built deliberately on top of the ruins of the old one. She told him about Grace, the woman at the shelter who had held her hand through all of it and kept the testimony file safe all these years. She told him about the envelope in her drawer, the forms with her name on them, the thing she had moved from hiding place to hiding place for 15 years because she could never bring herself to destroy it and could never bring herself to show it to anyone. She told him about tonight, about Grace's call, about Richard Hale and the federal investigator and the journalist and Hartley on the board. She told him all of it without strategy, without management, without the careful architecture of a woman presenting information to maximum effect. She just told the truth, plainly, completely, the way she had never told it to anyone. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the boys moving somewhere upstairs. The ordinary sounds of a household at night, life continuing its business around the edges of this moment. Kenji had not moved, had not spoken, had not changed his expression in any way that she could read. And the silence stretched, long enough that Elena's hands began to tremble in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs, long enough that the thing she had always feared most began to take shape in the room. Not the empire crumbling, not the school, not Marcus or Richard or any external force she had ever faced. The possibility of Kenji's eyes changing when he looked at her. Then he moved. He crossed the room in 3 steps, sat beside her, and took both her trembling hands in his. Careful, deliberate, the way he held things that mattered. "What was done to you," he said, his voice low and absolutely steady, "was never who you are. It never was. Not for a single second. And anyone who tries to use it against you will have to come through me first." Elena exhaled, a breath she felt like she had been holding for 15 years. Then Kenji was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Still gentle, but underneath it, something that needed an answer. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena looked at her husband, at the face she knew better than any face in the world, at the eyes she had been afraid of losing. "Because you are the one person in this world whose eyes I cannot afford to change," she said. "And I was afraid that knowing the worst of where I came from would make you see me differently." Kenji looked at her for a long moment. "Elena," his voice was quiet, "I knew about the placement agency before I proposed." The room tilted slightly. "I had you investigated," he said, "the way I investigate everything I let into my life. I found the records. I read the testimony file." He paused. "And then I got down on one knee. Because what I found wasn't a liability. It was the most courageous thing I had ever read about anyone." Elena stared at him. "You knew," she whispered. "I knew," he said. "And I chose you anyway. I will always choose you. But Elena," his hands tightened slightly around hers, "you should have told me. Not because I needed to know, but because you deserved to not carry it alone." The room was very quiet, and Elena, who had not cried in front of another person since she was 19 years old in a police station, let her head fall against her husband's shoulder, and stayed there. This is part 3, the final chapter of Elena's story, and I have to tell you, writing this one broke me open in the best way. If you have been with Elena from part 1 all the way to here, You already know parts 1 and 2 are in the comment section and the description below. Share them with someone who needs to start from the beginning. Don't forget to also hit the subscribe button. Now let's continue. They were at the kitchen table by midnight. Elena and Kenji, the testimony file open between them, mapping their response to the 3 threats Richard had activated simultaneously. The federal investigator, the journalist, Hartley on the board. For the first time in 3 parts, they were working as true equals. Not Kenji protecting Elena from a distance, not Elena managing everything alone before he found out. Together, side by side at their kitchen table in the middle of the night with the evidence of Elena's past between them and a plan taking shape. Kenji would handle Doyle, the testimony file delivered to the investigator's office by morning, framed with the full context that Richard had deliberately stripped away. It wouldn't just clear Elena, it would show that she was the reason those children went home, that she wasn't a loose end, she was the reason there was a case at all. Elena would handle the journalist directly, no intermediary. Her story, in her words, on her terms. Published before Richard's version could become the only version in circulation. That left Hartley and the board meeting. Elena's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Felt something she couldn't immediately name move through her chest. Soyeon, she answered with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned not to assume anything. Soyeon, I know about the file. Soyeon's voice was different from any version of it Elena had heard before. Stripped of silk and strategy. Direct. Urgent. Richard Hale contacted me 6 weeks ago. He wanted information on you and Kenji. Background. Vulnerabilities. A pause. I told him nothing. But I know what he found. And I know what he plans to do with it. Elena was very still. Kenji watched her face. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. Soyeon was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her voice was different, quieter, more honest than Elena had ever heard her. Because I watched you get down to that boy's level in the school hallway. For Jiho, a child who shares none of your blood, and I have spent too long being your enemy. When the truth is, you are the only woman I have ever met who is built the way I am built. A breath. And because Kenji needs to stay where he is, with you, my son needs his father present and whole. That does not happen if you fall. Elena held the phone, looked across the table at Kenji, who was watching her with the focused attention of a man trying to read a conversation from one side. Is that all? Elena asked. No, Soyeon paused. I have something Richard does not know I kept. The night he made his first call to Doyle, he made it from a restaurant. A restaurant where I happened to be having dinner with a business contact. Another pause. I recorded it, all of it. His voice, Doyle's responses, the instruction to omit Elena's testimony from his case file summary. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Soyeon, Elena said carefully, that recording ends this before it starts. I know, Soyeon said simply. That is why I kept it. Elena set the phone down after the call ended and looked at Kenji for a long moment. Then she said, Your ex-wife just saved us. Kenji looked at the phone, then at Elena, and something moved through his face that had no clean name. She saved you, he said quietly. There is a difference. Elena walked into the St. Jude's emergency board meeting alone. No Kenji waiting in the car, no shadow guard in the corridor, no file under her arm or empire at her back. Just her. Deep red blazer, natural hair, baby bump, and the specific, quiet authority of a woman who has decided that the truth is the only armor she needs today. The boardroom was the school library again, the same long table, the same high-backed chairs. 7 faces arranged in a row with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had called this meeting hoping for scandal and were not entirely sure what they were about to receive instead. Hartley sat at the center, the man who had never fully accepted Elena's presence in this school's power structure. He met her eyes when she walked in and looked away first. Elena took her place at the head of the table and she told her story, every word of it. From 19 years old to tonight. She did not soften it, did not manage it, did not perform remorse for something that was never her fault, or gratitude for being allowed to explain herself. She simply told the truth with the quiet authority of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally decided to set it down. Not because she is defeated, but because she is done letting it be used as a weapon against her. When she finished, the room was absolutely silent. Then the door opened. Grace walked in. 70 years old, silver hair. A woman who had spent 50 years working in crisis services and had the particular stillness of someone who has sat with people in the worst moments of their lives and learned that presence is the most powerful thing you can offer. She set the original testimony file on the table, every page, every name, every address Elena had given that night that led directly to the network's dismantling. "This woman saved children," Grace said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. She was barely more than a child herself when she did it. She sat in a police interview room for 6 hours and she gave them everything. Everything. She looked at the board one by one. I was there. I held her hand. And I will spend whatever time I have left making sure that is the only story that gets told about that night. Then the door opened again. So-Yun walked in, ivory coat, dark hair pinned back. The recording device in her hand, small, silver, already cued to the moment Richard Hale's voice began giving instructions to a federal investigator about what to omit from an official case summary. She placed it on the table beside the testimony file. Said nothing. She didn't need to. Hartley stared at the recording device, looked at the testimony file, looked at Elena standing at the head of the table with Grace on one side and So-Yun on the other. 3 women, 3 generations, 3 completely different stories that had converged in this room tonight to tell one truth. He stood up slowly and began to clap. One by one, the other board members rose. The applause was quiet, sincere. The kind that happens in rooms where something real just occurred and everyone present knows it. Elena stood at the head of that table. No army, no empire, no armor, and received the one thing she had never known she needed: to be fully seen, and chosen anyway. She did not cry. She simply stood straight and let it land, and in the back of the room Grace watched her and smiled the smile of a woman who always knew this moment was coming. Marcus found out about the recording the same way he had found out about most things recently. Too late, from the wrong person, after the damage was already done. Doyle closed the inquiry by morning. The testimony file and recording together made the case not just airtight, but actively embarrassing for anyone who had tried to use it. Richard's voice on that recording, giving explicit instructions to shape an official investigation, was the kind of thing that had consequences well beyond Elena's story. The journalist published Elena's account that same afternoon. Her words, her framing, her voice telling her own story before anyone else could tell it for her. By evening, it had been shared more times than anything the journalist had ever published. Not because it was a scandal, because it was the truth. And people can feel the difference. By nightfall, the St. Jude's board meeting result had moved through the school community, the way results always move in small contained worlds. Quickly, completely, unstoppably. Richard Hale called Marcus at 9 p.m. The conversation was not long. Richard said what he had built his entire life saying: controlled, precise, the words of a man who measured everything before he released it. But underneath the control, tonight was something different. The specific, cold fury of a man who planned everything, and watched it fail anyway. And beneath even that, something Richard would never name out loud, but that was present in every silence between his words: disappointment. In himself, in his son, in the whole architecture of what he had built and what it had produced. He told Marcus it was over, that there was nothing left to pursue, that continuing would now expose the Hale name to consequences that even Richard's connections could not fully contain. Marcus listened to every word. When his father hung up, Marcus sat alone in the quiet of his exile apartment, with the specific stillness of a man at the end of something. Not a battle, something larger. A version of himself he had been holding on to for 3 years through humiliation and exile and desperate planning. The version that believed he could still undo what Elena had become. He picked up his phone, looked at the photograph of Noah and Jiho she had sent him. Those 2 boys sitting side by side in Noah's room doing homework, completely unbothered, completely at home with each other. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set his phone down, picked up a pen, opened the notebook on his table. He thought about what to say for a few minutes. Then he began to write. Not to Elena, not to Kenji, not to Richard, to Noah. He wrote about the things he should have done, the calls he should have made, the boy he should have known. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He had enough self-awareness left to know that was not his to ask for. He just wrote the truth, plainly. The way you write when there is nobody left to perform for. He wrote until his hand ached and the page was full. Then he folded it carefully, put it in an envelope, wrote Noah's name on the front. He didn't send it, not yet. He wasn't sure he ever would. But he wrote it, because some things need to be said. Even when the only person who benefits from the saying is the one holding the pen. 3 days after the board meeting, Elena called Soyun. They met at the same restaurant, the same quiet corner table, the same white tablecloth. But everything about this meeting was different from the first one. No strategic color choices, no silk over steel. Elena arrived in a simple camel coat, natural hair loose. Soyun in a soft gray blouse, hair down for the first time Elena had ever seen it. 2 women who had stopped needing to perform for each other. They ordered tea. Sat for a moment in a silence that was comfortable in a way their first silence had never been. Elena thanked her first, properly, fully, without qualification or management. She looked Soyun in the eyes and told her that what she had done, keeping that recording, making that call, walking into that boardroom, had changed the outcome of everything. Soyun received it the way she received most things, quietly, with the stillness of a woman who had learned that grace looks like not making someone feel small for needing to express gratitude. Then Elena told her about the donor recognition, founding level, Soyun's name on the school's annual acknowledgement alongside Elena's. Soyun looked at her for a moment. You didn't have to do that. No, Elena agreed, but you earned it. They were quiet for a moment. Then Soyun did something Elena had not seen her do across any version of their relationship in any of the 3 parts of this story. She told the truth. Not strategically, not as a move, just the truth. She told Elena about Kenji, the real version, not the version shaped for maximum impact, not the version designed to create doubt or pressure. The full, human, complicated version of 2 young people who had been promised to each other by fathers who made decisions over their heads and had tried, genuinely tried, to become what those fathers wanted. She told Elena that she had loved him, that walking away from that when he chose Elena had been one of the most painful things she had ever done, and that she had spent years directing that pain outward instead of processing it honestly. She looked at Elena when she finished. He chose right, she said. I need you to know that I know that now. Not because I am saying what you need to hear, because it is true. Elena held her gaze. Then she reached across the white tablecloth and took Soyeon's hand fully, equally. Our children are fully, equally. Our children are brothers, Elena said quietly. That makes us something too. Soyeon looked down at their hands on the tablecloth. At this moment that nobody had scripted, and nobody had planned, and nobody in the long, complicated history of everything between them could have predicted. And she smiled. A real one. With nothing underneath it but relief. Outside on the street, the city moved around them the way it always did, fast, indifferent, loud. But in that quiet corner of that restaurant, two women who had been on opposite sides of the same story finally found the same side. And stayed there. 6 weeks later, Elena's daughter arrived. The delivery room was quiet and bright. Nothing like a battlefield, nothing like a boardroom, nothing like any of the arenas Elena had walked into and refused to leave without winning. Just a room, clean light, the particular hush of a space where something new is about to begin. Kenji held his daughter for the first time, and the man who had dismantled empires and faced down federal investigations and navigated the full, complicated weight of his own history stood there with this tiny girl in his arms and could not find a single word. He just stood there, holding her, his face doing something it had never done in 3 parts of this story, coming completely undone. Noah sat in the chair beside Elena's bed, serious, careful, already the most protective big brother this girl would ever have in her life. He watched Kenji hold her with the focused attention of a boy who understood instinctively that this moment was important and needed to be witnessed properly. Jiho sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Part of this family now, not because anyone had made a formal announcement or drafted a legal document or sat the boys down for an awkward conversation, just because that is what had happened. Quietly, naturally, the way real things happen when you stop forcing them and let them find their own shape. 2 brothers, side by side, watching their sister take her first breath. Kenji looked at Elena over the baby's head, and whatever passed between them in that look was not something that needed words. It was the look of 2 people who had been through fire together, real fire. The kind that tests whether what you have is real or just the appearance of something real, and come out the other side still standing, still choosing each other, still here. Elena looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she looked at Grace. Grace was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, the woman who had held 19-year-old Elena's hand through the worst night of her life, who had kept a testimony file safe for 15 years, who had walked into a school board meeting at 70 years old because some things are worth showing up for, regardless of age or exhaustion or the easier option of staying home. Elena reached out her hand. Grace crossed the room and took it without a word. Outside in the hospital corridor, Soyeon sat in a waiting room chair with Chiho's handmade card for the baby spread across her lap. He had spent 2 hours on it the evening before, very serious about the colors, restarting twice because it wasn't right yet, finally satisfied with the 3rd version, which featured what appeared to be a dragon and a crown and a great deal of gold crayon. She looked at it, smiled, carefully put it in her bag so it wouldn't crease. She did not go inside. That room belonged to Elena today. To Elena and Kenji and the children and Grace, and the specific sacred privacy of a family at the beginning of something new. But she was here, in the corridor, close enough. And being here was more than enough. It was everything. Back in the room, Kenji carefully handed the baby back to Elena. Elena settled her daughter against her chest, looked at her face, new, unmarked, carrying no history yet, owing nothing to anyone, beginning entirely on her own terms. And she whispered, "Nobody will ever make you feel like you don't belong. Not in this world. Not anywhere." Because you were born into a dynasty that was built from nothing. From 19 years old and a city that didn't know my name, and a girl who had no options and made herself one anyway. That is your inheritance. Not the money, not the name, not the school or the empire or any of it. She paused. The refusal, the absolute refusal to stay down. That is what you come from, and that is what you are. The baby's eyes opened, dark, bright, completely new, looking at her mother for the first time with the unfocused, wondering gaze of someone who has just arrived and is taking stock of where they have landed. Noah leaned forward in his chair to look at his sister properly. "She looks like Mum," he said softly. Kenji smiled. "She does." Jiho nodded with the gravity of someone delivering an important verdict. "That's good," he said. "Mum is the strongest." The room laughed, softly, the kind of laughter that lives in rooms where something real just happened and everyone present knows it, and nobody wants to move too quickly in case the moment ends. Kenji's phone buzzed on the bedside table. He glanced at it. An unknown name. Coordinates. One line of text that neither of them recognized. He showed it to Elena. She read it, looked at her daughter, looked at her family filling this small, bright room. Kenji, Noah, Jiho, Grace. A new girl with brand new eyes who had no idea yet what world she had been born into, or what it had taken to make it safe for her. "Not today," Elena said. She handed the phone back, laid her head against the pillow, closed her eyes. And for the first time in 3 parts, across 3 years of fighting and building and refusing to be defined by what was done to her, and refusing to let anyone take what she had built from nothing, Elena simply rested. The camera pulls back slowly. This room, this family, whole and complicated and unbreakable and completely, permanently, undeniably theirs, fades to black. And that is how you build a dynasty, not with perfection, with grace, with fight, with the absolute refusal to let anyone, write your story for you. Elena started with nothing, a city that didn't know her name, a girl with no options who made herself one. And look at where she landed. If this 3-part story has moved you, if any part of it touched something real in you, please share this final chapter right now with someone who needs to hear it today. Parts 1 and 2 are in the comments section and the description below. Send them to someone who needs to start from the beginning. Drop a crown in the comments if you have been here from part 1. Drop a fire if part 3 broke you open. And tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. I want to see every single country in these comments one last time. My husband made me a promise and we are so close. Every subscribe, every comment, every share gets me there. Hit that button right now. This channel exists because of every single one of you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with Elena from the very beginning. We will see you in the next story.